3 scary true security guard horror stories. Story 1. The Parking Garage. My name is Marcus, I'm 28, and I worked as a security guard at the Riverview office complex for about 2 years. It's a massive building in the downtown area with 12 floors of offices and a 5-level underground parking garage. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most of the time I was completely alone in the building except for the occasional cleaner or someone working late. The job itself wasn't complicated. I had to do rounds every 2 hours, checking that all doors were secure, no windows were broken, and nothing was out of place. Between rounds, I'd sit at the security desk in the main lobby, watching the security cameras and occasionally doing paperwork. The parking garage was always the worst part of my rounds. The lighting down there was minimal, just enough to see where you're going, but not enough to eliminate all the shadows. The concrete walls and low ceiling made every sound echo, and the place always smelled like exhaust and damp concrete. Level P3 was particularly bad. For some reason, about half the lights on that level never worked properly. No matter how many times maintenance replaced the bulbs, they'd work for a day or two, then flicker and die again. Management eventually gave up and just left that level dimmer than the others. The first strange thing happened about 6 months into the job. I was doing my 2 a.m. round checking the parking levels when I noticed a car on P3 that hadn't been there during my midnight check. It was an older model sedan, dark blue or black. It was hard to tell in the dim light. The car was parked in a corner spot, away from the few other cars left overnight. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes people from the building worked late and left after my midnight round. But as I approached the car, I noticed there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. Just sitting there, engine off, no lights on. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "The building's closed. Is everything okay?" The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I could see it was a man in a suit just staring straight ahead through the windshield. I tapped on the window, and he slowly turned to look at me. His face was wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, and his expression was completely blank. No surprise, no annoyance, nothing. He just stared at me without blinking. "Sir, you can't stay here," I said, trying to sound authoritative despite my growing unease. "The parking garage closes at 11. After what felt like forever, he nodded slowly and started the car. I stepped back as he pulled out of the space and drove toward the exit ramp. I watched on the security cameras to make sure he left the premises, then continued with my round. The next night, during my 2 a.m. check, the same car was in the exact same spot on P3, and the same man was sitting in the driver's seat staring straight ahead. This time, I called my supervisor before approaching the vehicle. He told me to note the license plate number and ask the man to leave, and if he refused, to call the police. But when I turned back to the car, it was gone. I hadn't heard an engine start or tires on concrete. The space was just empty. I convinced myself I was seeing things due to the late hour and the bad lighting. But the next night, as I was watching the security monitors around 1:30 a.m., I saw a dark sedan pull into the P3 level and park in that same corner spot. I switched to the camera that should have shown the driver getting out, but no one exited the vehicle. I decided to go down immediately to confront the driver. When the elevator doors opened on P3, I felt a blast of cold air, much colder than the rest of the garage. As I walked toward where the car should have been, my flashlight started to flicker. I smacked it against my palm a few times, and it stabilized. But when I reached the corner, the parking space was empty. No car, no driver, nothing. I stood there for a moment, confused, then slowly turned in a circle, scanning the entire level. There were only 3 other cars on that floor, all belonging to employees I recognized who occasionally worked late. The dark sedan was nowhere to be seen. I checked the security footage when I got back to the desk. The camera clearly showed the sedan entering P3, parking, and then nothing. No footage of it leaving. It just disappeared between camera frames. These occurrences continued for weeks. Sometimes I'd see the car on the cameras but not find it when I checked in person. Sometimes I'd find it during my rounds with the same motionless driver inside, who would nod and drive away when confronted, only to disappear before reaching the exit. Once, I even followed it all the way to the exit ramp, only to find nothing when I got there, just an empty ramp with no sign of a car having been there seconds before. I started dreading my rounds on P3. The maintenance staff complained about constant electrical issues on that level, lights burning out, security cameras failing. Even the emergency phones would go dead for hours at a time. Then one night, I saw something on the cameras that made my blood run cold. The sedan appeared on P3 around 1 a.m. as usual. But this time, the driver got out. He was tall, wearing a dark suit that hung loosely on his thin frame. He stood by his car for a moment, then looked directly up at the camera. Even through the grainy footage, I could see that same blank expression. Then he pointed to something off camera and walked slowly in that direction, disappearing from view. I radioed the other night guard, who patrolled the adjacent building, to come over while I investigated. I didn't want to go down there alone, but I also couldn't ignore a trespasser. When my colleague arrived, we took the elevator down to P3 together. The cold hit us immediately. It was like walking into a freezer. Our radios started emitting static the moment we stepped off the elevator. We found the car in its usual spot, empty. As we approached it, I noticed something on the concrete near the driver's door, what looked like a dark stain about the size of a dinner plate. I crouched down to examine it and realized with horror that it was blood. Not fresh, but not old enough to have completely dried either. "We should call the police," my colleague said, already backing toward the elevator. That's when our flashlights went out simultaneously. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw a figure standing about 30 feet away. The man from the car, still in his dark suit. He was just standing there, watching us. Then he raised his arm and pointed again, this time toward a maintenance door in the concrete wall. My colleague saw it too. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the garage. The figure didn't respond. It just kept pointing at the door, its arm unnaturally still. We backed toward the elevator, keeping our eyes on the figure. When the doors opened behind us, we practically fell inside. As the doors were closing, I saw the figure moving toward us with a stiff, unnatural gait. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, they found the bloodstain on the concrete, but no sign of the man or the car. They took samples of the blood and checked the maintenance door, which was locked from the outside with no signs of tampering. A week later, my supervisor called me into his office. The police had identified the blood through DNA testing. It belonged to a man named Richard Mercer, a financial analyst who had worked on the 8th floor of our building until about a year before I started. According to the report, Mercer had committed suicide in his car in the P3 level of our parking garage. He had been found by the morning shift security guard, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The car described in the report was a dark blue sedan, the same make and model as the one I'd been seeing. The thing that haunts me the most, the maintenance door the figure had been pointing to led to a small electrical room. When the police checked it, they found something the initial investigation had missed, a suicide note hidden behind an electrical panel. In it, Mercer claimed he was being forced to take his own life by his business partners, who had threatened his family if he didn't comply with their demands to cover up financial crimes. It wasn't suicide, it was murder. 3 executives from the company were eventually arrested based on evidence in that note. But the car still appears on P3 sometimes. I know because I quit that job, but my replacement has seen it too. The driver still points to that door. Even though his killers have been brought to justice, some things don't rest, even after the truth comes out. Story 2. The Empty Floor. I'm David, 34 years old, and I worked security for a high-rise office building in Seattle for almost 3 years. The building had 32 floors, with various companies occupying different levels. My shift was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and I was the only security personnel on duty during those hours. The building was relatively new, maybe 10 years old, with modern security systems, keycard access, and cameras covering all common areas. My job involved monitoring those cameras, doing regular rounds, and responding to any alarms or issues that came up during the night. One peculiarity of the building was the 17th floor. It was completely vacant and had been since the building opened. The property management company claimed they were waiting for the right tenant, but it seemed strange that a prime floor in a downtown high-rise would stay empty for so long. Some of the daytime guards had rumors about why: failed lease negotiations, structural issues they didn't want to fix, even superstitious executives who didn't want to occupy a floor with 17 in it. I didn't pay much attention to the gossip. The empty floor was part of my rounds, even though there was nothing there to check except the stairwell doors and emergency systems. It was just an open space with bare concrete floors, exposed ceiling pipes, and support columns. No interior walls had ever been built. The floor-to-ceiling windows were covered with paper from the inside, presumably to prevent people from seeing the unfinished space from the outside. For the first 6 months on the job, my visits to the 17th floor were uneventful. It was always cold and silent, with only the sound of the ventilation system humming in the background. Sometimes I'd find coffee cups or food wrappers left by maintenance workers, but nothing out of the ordinary. That changed on a Tuesday night in November. I was doing my 2 a.m. round and had just stepped off the elevator onto the 17th floor when I noticed something different. There was a desk in the middle of the otherwise empty space, an old wooden desk that looked completely out of place in the modern building. No chair, no other furniture, just this desk sitting there, as if someone had deliberately placed it. I approached it cautiously. The desk was covered in dust, and it looked antique, the kind with ornate carvings on the legs and sides. It had 3 drawers, down the right side, all closed. I tried the top drawer, but it was locked. I radioed down to the front desk, asking if anyone had authorization to bring furniture onto the 17th floor. The answer was no. No tenant improvements were scheduled, and no one had accessed that floor with a key card in over a week, except for me during my regular rounds. I wrote up an incident report and continued my rounds, figuring that maintenance or the property manager would deal with it in the morning. But when I checked the 17th floor during my 4 a.m. round, the desk was gone. No trace of it remained, not even marks on the dusty concrete floor where it had stood. It was as if it had never been there at all. I questioned the morning crew about it, but no one knew anything. No one had removed a desk, and the cameras in the elevator lobbies showed no one bringing furniture in or out of the 17th floor during my shift. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but I had photos I'd taken for the incident report. The desk had definitely been there, and now it definitely wasn't. A week later, during my 3 a.m. round, I found something new on the 17th floor. A single wooden chair, positioned in the exact spot where the desk had been. It matched the desk in style with the same ornate carvings on its legs and back. And like the desk, it looked extremely out of place in the bare industrial space. This time, I wasn't content just filing a report. I examined the chair carefully, taking photos from all angles. There was something etched into the back, a date, 1901. The building we were in hadn't even been constructed until 2010, so this chair predated it by over a century. I completed my round but kept checking the camera feed for the 17th floor throughout the night. No one entered, yet when I went back for my 5 a.m. check, the chair was gone. Just like the desk, it had vanished without explanation. These incidents continued over the next few months. I would find a single piece of antique furniture on the 17th floor. A bookcase, a coat rack, a tall clock with no hands, and it would disappear within hours, leaving no trace. I started doing research into the history of the city block where our building stood. Before our high-rise, there had been a smaller office building from the 1960s. Before that, an apartment building from the 1930s. and before that stretching back to the early 1900s, a large family home belonging to a timber baron named Sullivan. Old photographs of Sullivan's house showed ornate woodwork and antique furniture that matched the style of the pieces appearing on the 17th floor. Sullivan had reportedly gone mad after his wife's death, locking himself in his study and refusing to leave until his own death in 1904. The house had remained in the family until the 1920s, when it was sold and eventually demolished. I began to feel uneasy during my checks of the 17th floor. The temperature seemed to drop even lower than usual, and I often had the sensation of being watched. My flashlight would flicker inexplicably, and sometimes I'd hear what sounded like whispered conversations that would stop as soon as I tried to locate their source. The strangest incident occurred about 7 months into these bizarre appearances. I stepped off the elevator for my 2 a.m. round and found the 17th floor completely transformed. Instead of bare concrete and support columns, I was standing in what appeared to be an early 1900s study. There was dark wood paneling on the walls, a massive Persian rug on the floor, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and a large window looking out on a view of Seattle from a century ago. In the center of the room was the desk I had first discovered, but now it had a chair, a lit oil lamp, and papers scattered across its surface. Sitting at the desk was an elderly man in period clothing, writing something with a fountain pen. He didn't acknowledge my presence. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. The rational part of my brain knew I was still in an empty, unfinished office floor in 2023, not in someone's study from 1904. "Hello," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The man stopped writing, but didn't look up. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice raspy and distant. "This is my house, my study, my sanctuary." "I'm just doing my job," I replied, surprised I could form words at all. "Your building is built on my land," he continued, still not looking at me. "Your 17th floor is where my study stood, my sanctuary, where I spent my final days." A chill ran through me as I realized I was speaking to what must be the ghost of Sullivan himself. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. He finally looked up, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were hollow black spaces like empty sockets, and his skin had a gray, translucent quality. "They tore down my house," he said, "but they couldn't tear down what happened here. What I did here." He slowly opened the top drawer of the desk and removed something that glinted in the lamplight. A revolver, old and tarnished but unmistakable. "My wife didn't die of illness like they wrote in the papers," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "I killed her in this room, and then myself." He raised the gun, not toward me but to his own temple. I turned and ran for the elevator, frantically pushing the call button. When the doors finally opened, I practically fell inside and repeatedly jabbed the lobby button. As the doors were closing, I caught one last glimpse of the 17th floor. It was back to bare concrete and support columns. No study, no furniture, no ghostly figure. I was shaking so badly that I could barely stand. I went to the security office and sat there until I could compose myself. I told myself it had been a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and too many ghost stories about the building. But when I reviewed the security footage, something impossible appeared. The camera in the 17th floor elevator lobby clearly showed me stepping off the elevator, then standing completely still for almost 5 minutes, staring into the empty floor space. Then I suddenly turned and ran back to the elevator as if fleeing from something, genuine terror visible on my face. I gave my notice the next day. My replacement hasn't reported anything unusual about the 17th floor, but then again, he doesn't do his rounds as thoroughly as I did. Sometimes I wonder if Sullivan only reveals himself to those who pay attention, who notice the furniture he places as breadcrumbs leading to his confession. All I know is that I will never set foot in that building again. Some spaces don't just contain remnants of the past, they contain moments frozen in time. playing out over and over again for anyone unlucky enough to glimpse them. Story 3. The Night Visitor. My name is Sarah, I'm 25, and I worked security at Pinecrest Apartments for about 8 months. It's an upscale residential building with about 200 units spread over 18 floors. Security was taken pretty seriously there. All visitors had to sign in at the front desk, and we had cameras covering all entrances, elevators, and hallways. I worked the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The job was fairly straightforward: monitor the security cameras, do hourly patrols of common areas, and help any residents who needed assistance during the night. It was usually quiet, with maybe 1 or 2 residents coming home late from a night out, or the occasional delivery person dropping off a package. The building had a strict visitor policy. After 9 p.m., all guests needed to be accompanied by a resident at all times. If anyone showed up claiming to be visiting a resident, we had to call the apartment to confirm before letting them up. Most of the residents were professionals who valued their privacy and security, so they appreciated these measures. About 3 months into the job, I started noticing something odd in the camera feeds. Every night, usually between 2 and 3 a.m., a tall man in a dark coat would appear in the main lobby. I never saw him enter through any of the doors. He would just suddenly be there, walking purposefully toward the elevators. He always kept his head down, making it difficult to see his face clearly on the cameras. The first time I noticed him, I immediately checked the visitor log to see if someone had signed in while I was doing my rounds. There was nothing. I reviewed the door camera footage, but there was no sign of him entering the building. Yet there he was, on the lobby camera, getting into elevator 2 and pressing a button. I watched as the elevator indicator showed it going up to the 12th floor. I switched to the 12th floor hallway camera, expecting to see him exit, but no one did. The elevator doors opened on an empty car, then closed again after a moment. I assumed it was just a camera glitch, or maybe a resident I hadn't noticed before who had come in while I was distracted. I made a note of it, but didn't think much more about it. The next night, the same thing happened. The man appeared in the lobby around 2:30 a.m., took elevator 2 up to the 12th floor, but never exited the elevator on camera. This time, I immediately went up to check the 12th floor myself. The hallway was empty and quiet, with no sign that anyone had recently passed through. Over the next few weeks, this pattern continued almost nightly. Always the same man, always appearing suddenly in the lobby, always taking elevator 2 to the 12th floor, and always seeming to vanish before exiting the elevator. I started calling him the Night Visitor in my incident reports. I mentioned it to my supervisor, who reviewed the footage but didn't seem particularly concerned. "Probably just a camera sync issue," he said. "The timestamps on different cameras might be off by a few seconds, so you're missing him exiting the elevator." That explanation made sense, but I wasn't convinced. I started paying special attention during my 2 a.m. rounds, making sure I was in the lobby during the time the night visitor usually appeared. For several nights, nothing happened when I was physically present in the lobby. But as soon as I went back to the security office, the cameras would catch him again. Then came the night that changed everything. I was at the front desk around 2:15 a.m. when the door to the stairwell opened and the man in the dark coat stepped into the lobby. This was different. I'd never seen him use the stairs before, only appear suddenly in the lobby. He walked directly toward the front desk where I was sitting. As he got closer, I could finally see his face clearly. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with deeply lined features and dark, intense eyes. His coat looked expensive but somewhat outdated in style. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound professional despite my unease. "Can I help you?" He stopped a few feet from the desk and stared at me for an uncomfortably long moment. "You've been watching me," he finally said. His voice was deep and had an unusual quality to it, almost like it was coming from farther away than he actually was. "Sir, are you a resident here?" I asked, reaching for the phone to call my supervisor. "I've lived on the 12th floor for many years," he replied. "Apartment 1214. I knew that apartment. It belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who had lived in the building since it opened 15 years ago. Sir, that's not correct. 1214 is registered to another resident. A strange smile spread across his face. Check your records again. Look deeper. I was the first to live there. Before I could respond, the lobby lights flickered briefly. When they stabilized, the man was gone. I jumped up from my chair and looked around the lobby, but there was no sign of him. He couldn't have reached the elevators or any exit in the second the lights were out. Shaken, I returned to the security office and immediately pulled up the camera footage from the past few minutes. To my horror, it showed me sitting alone at the front desk, occasionally looking up and speaking to thin air. The man hadn't appeared on camera at all, even though I'd seen him clearly and spoken to him face to face. The next morning, I asked the property manager about the history of apartment 1214. She seemed reluctant to discuss it, but eventually told me that before Mrs. Chen, the apartment had been unoccupied for nearly 2 years because of an unfortunate incident. With some further research, I discovered that the previous occupant had been a retired judge named Robert Grayson, who had died in the apartment. The official cause was a heart attack, but there were rumors among the older staff that it had actually been suicide. Grayson had apparently become reclusive after receiving death threats related to some of his controversial rulings. He had rarely left the apartment in his final months and was found days after his death only because neighbors complained about an odor. I found an old photograph of Judge Grayson online, and my blood ran cold. It was him, the night visitor, the man I had spoken to in the lobby. That night, I was on edge during my entire shift. Around 2 a.m., I was monitoring the cameras when I noticed something strange happening on the 12th floor hallway feed. The door to apartment 1214 was opening slowly, even though I knew Mrs. Chen was out of town visiting family. I radioed for backup from a nearby building's security team and headed up to investigate. As the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, I felt an immediate chill in the air. The hallway was darker than it should have been, with several of the light fixtures not working. The door to 1214 was indeed partially open. Protocol dictated that I should wait for backup before investigating a possible break-in, but something compelled me to approach the door. As I got closer, I could hear what sounded like papers being shuffled inside, and a man's voice muttering something indistinct. "Security," I called out, one hand on my radio. "Is someone in there?" The sounds immediately stopped. There was a moment of complete silence. Then the door slowly opened wider, seemingly on its own. The apartment beyond was dark, but I could make out what looked like stacks of papers and folders scattered across the floor. I was about to step inside when I heard a whisper that seemed to come from right next to my ear. "They found me. They're coming to finish what they started." I whirled around, but the hallway behind me was empty. When I turned back, the apartment door was closed, and a paper had been slipped halfway under it. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago, with the headline, "Controversial Judge Dies at Home." But someone had crossed out the words "dies at home," and written in red ink, "was murdered." The elevator dinged, announcing the arrival of my backup. By the time they reached me, I was still standing there, staring at the clipping in my hands. When I showed it to them, they looked confused. All they saw was a blank piece of paper. I insisted we check the apartment. The property manager was called, and we entered with the master key. Inside, we found Mrs. Chen's perfectly normal, tidy apartment, with no scattered papers, no sign of disturbance, and certainly no evidence of the chaos I'd glimpsed through the open door. The newspaper clipping had disappeared from my pocket. After that night, the appearances of the night visitor became less frequent, but more disturbing. Sometimes, I would find old legal documents in the lobby that would disappear if I took my eyes off them for a second. The elevator would often stop at the 12th floor without anyone having pressed the button, opening to an empty hallway. The most terrifying incident happened during my final week on the job. I was doing my 3 a.m. round on the 12th floor when all the lights went out simultaneously. In the emergency lighting, I saw the night visitor standing at the end of the hallway, but this time he looked different. His face was bloated and discolored, his eyes bulging, and there was a dark mark around his neck like a bruise or ligature mark. He raised his hand and pointed at apartment 1214, then at me. "They're still here," he said, his voice gurgling as if speaking through fluid. "They're still in the building. Find them." The lights came back on and he was gone. I quit the next day. 2 months later, I read in the news the police had arrested 2 men in connection with a cold case involving the murder of Judge Robert Grayson. The investigation revealed that his heart attack had been induced by a specialized poison that was nearly untraceable. The men were former clients of a drug trafficker Grayson had sentenced to life without parole. The most chilling detail: both men had been living in Pinecrest Apartments for years, one on the 8th floor and one on the 14th. They had been there the entire time I worked security, passing through the lobby I monitored, riding in the elevators I watched, always just a few floors away from the scene of their crime. Sometimes I wonder if the night visitor is at peace now that his killers have been caught. But I also wonder if he appears to the new security guard, still taking elevator 2 up to the 12th floor every night, still trapped in his endless routine, forever trying to tell someone what really happened to him.